Thank you, Sarah Buckley. Hi, everybody. I'm Justin Evertson, Green Infrastructure Coordinator with the Nebraska Forest Service and the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. Welcome to our July Waterwise webinar. We've been doing these every other month or so since early in the year as a part of our Waterwise Landscapes initiative. And the topic is pretty timely this summer, isn't it, with what we've seen from both flooding and extra wetness out west to a lack of rain. I've never seen anything like it in the Lincoln Waverly area where I live from late June of 2022 to just the end of June this year. We were 18 inches below normal for that year-long stretch, the driest stretch on record. And I think the one saving grace we had around here is that our spring and summer, early summer hadn't gotten too hot yet. So thankfully for some of us here in the East Northeast, it started raining again the last couple of weeks. That has helped lessen the drought extreme a little bit. But as Sarah Browning and others are going to tell us, we're not out of the woods yet. So just be aware of that. We thought it'd be timely to dive in on this whole topic of the drought, how it's impacting us, and what to think going forward, because I understand that Sarah Browning is also good at meteorology and she can tell us what the future holds, maybe, right, Sarah?
Yeah. I forgot my crystal ball at home today, Justin, so yeah. I'm not going to be able to help this time.
I think the one thing we all know is that we can't predict the weather around here, right? It's this is a strange part of the world, and every year I say, wow, what a weird year. So that's normal when it's a weird year. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Sarah Buckley, real quickly here. She coordinates the Waterwise Landscapes initiatives, and she'll have a couple updates for you, including just make you aware of grant funds that we have available for both tree planting and project development. So go ahead, Sarah Buckley.
Okay. Hi, everybody. The first thing I want to do is I promised that I wouldn't call on her today, but I do just want to have our current intern. Do you just want to wave hi, Sarah? We have an intern with us this summer who has been, you've probably seen her on some project sites and you will this fall, but we're very happy to have her with us. So as far as grant funding goes, we are currently taking applications for our Greener Towns and Waterwise Landscapes programs, as well as Trees for Nebraska Towns and Fall Free Trees. There's a lot going on. PlantNebraska.org has all of it, but the easiest way sometimes is just to send me or Justin an email and say, I have a project that's interested in funding. The deadlines for all the programs is going to be August 15th if you want to put plants in the ground this fall, and September 15th if you are looking to prepare this fall for a spring planting. I think the only one that has a different deadline is Fall Free Trees. Do you know that one, Justin? Or did that close?
Right at the end of July, it will close. 10 free trees. For
so you have 11 days left for 10 free trees. So yeah, just give us an email at any project that's sponsored by a nonprofit, government agency, city, school. We've been working with a lot of faith communities lately, neighborhood associations, can qualify for 50% reimbursement on green infrastructure projects. So send us an email if you have thoughts in the works that may qualify for that. I think that's all the announcements that I need to make. So we will turn it over to our guests, Sarah Browning, Nicole Stoner, and Becky Schuerman, to talk about, just an update on the drought and timely adjustments we can make to our watering schedule, and how everything is impacting our trees and our landscapes.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So I'm Sarah Browning. I'm an extension educator out of the Lancaster office, and I'm going to be co-teaching this program today with my colleagues, Nicole and Becky. And so I will let Nicole and Becky introduce themselves also.
I'm Nicole Stoner. I'm the horticulture educator in Gage County. So I cover Beatrice, but all of Southeast Nebraska up to Lincoln and over to Grand Island area. So yeah, I work in a lot in trees as well as some other things. So.
And I'm Becky Schuerman. I'm an extension associate based out of the Lancaster County Extension Office, but I'm a statewide position for domestic water and on-site wastewater. And I'd be interested to find out if any of you use water from a private well situation rather than municipal water as far as the work you do.
So maybe that's something they could put in the chat box is let us know what kind of water source they're using, if it's municipal water or if they're watering from a well. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and share our PowerPoint. And, you know, as Justin said, you know, maybe the fact that we scheduled this presentation helped it start to rain. And if that's the case, then, hey, that's fine. But we know that we still will be dealing with drought for a while, the impact of drought and the damage that it's caused. And so it's important to think about those things and what lingering effects that we might still be seeing in landscapes that are drought related. So here again, here's the team that you have with you today. And at the very last slide, we have our contact information. So if you have any follow-up questions, you'll be able to get in touch with us. And so just quickly wanted to look at where we're at right now or as of Monday. These were the drought conditions within Nebraska. Here in Lancaster County, we are edging out of the drought a little bit. At least we're going from extreme drought down to severe drought, which is better, which is an improvement. Omaha, the Douglas Sarpy area is still considered extreme drought. And you can see where you're at in the state, what your conditions might be. But even though it has started raining, that doesn't mean the drought is over. So to start us off today, we're going to talk about some drought-induced landscape issues. And Nicole is going to take this section for us. So I'm going to pass it over to Nicole now.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Sarah. We can move on to the next slide here. So when we're thinking about the drought and how weather is changing and our climate is changing. Some of the things we might start thinking about is, this could happen again. It happened really extensively in 2012. And here we are again, about 11 years later, facing the same problems. So when we're out there planting new things, we might want to think about those drought tolerant plants. For trees, I know some of them are a little better than others. Obviously, things like swamp white oak is not one that's very good for drought conditions. But I have a fairly young bur oak in my yard that is doing quite well through the drought. I've watered, as needed, but it's doing quite well in comparison to some of the other ones. So looking at some of those types, some of the shrubs you can look at, like blue mist spireas. Of course, like sand cherry is really great for drought conditions, lead plant, barberry, some of those. And there is a very long list of perennials. I just threw a few of our real common ones on here, but there's a full list of perennials in Waterwise Landscapes. It's a NEB guide, and you can find that at go.unl.edu/waterwise perennials. And that's going to include, of course, the coneflowers, your butterfly milkweed, even hostas, sedum, penstemon, things like that, that are going to do really well in the drought situation. Now, this does not mean that they don't need watered at all. It just means that they can tolerate a little more of a drought situation with, in like a situation like what we're facing this year. They still needed watered, but maybe not, they didn't struggle as bad as some of the other plants. Okay, Sarah. So some of the symptoms that we've been seeing this year, of course, wilting happens through any sort of drought stress situation. You might have limited blooms or even no blooms at all. When we see drought stress that extends a long period of time, especially when you couple that with extreme heat, which fortunately we haven't had too hot of weather this summer. But if you put those two together, that's where we start seeing that premature leaf drop. And that's going to be like, you might see next month, start seeing some things start turning their fall color and even start dropping those leaves. when normally they do that in later September or October, but they've built enough energy up that they'll be all right. It's just that they're ready to go to bed for the winter. They've had enough. One of the more common things we've seen this year is that branch or top dieback. And so a lot of, especially like river birches, again, there's that water in the name. And so river birches, we've had a lot of top dieback in those. The top third to top half of the tree is completely bare this year, just due to the long-term drought through the winter and that. Because they're stressed, you're going to see more insect and disease problems throughout. Once a tree is stressed, then it's harder for it to combat those problems. And they don't have those defenses as well as they do when they're in a really good, healthy situation. And part of that is that root damage. And then you might see limited growth during that year. So you can look at it, when you look at tree rings, you can see the smaller rings, the ones that don't have as much growth. And those are bad years. Those are bad growth years, and drought will do that. So you may notice your oak only grew 2 or 3 inches this year versus a foot or so that they normally grow. So that's just another thing to be aware of that could happen in your landscape. And that damage can be seen for a lot of different years. So typically when we have an extensive drought like what we've been seeing, you will see the damage from that for up to 5 years later, or maybe even more, but it has to be multiple years of normal precipitation to get them back into that. And so don't be surprised if we're seeing some of these drought stress issues in the next year or 2 or even 3. You get further down the line and you forget about these problems, right? So go ahead, Sarah. So in the first little bit after, or when drought starts to occur, the first year or so, or first few months, first few weeks, you'll see those fine feeder roots that start to die. And then over, a few more weeks or even months, those larger fibrous roots will start to die. And it's going to take a while for those to regrow. And so that's causing problems to our plants. Of course, the ones we've seen the most damage from, especially early this spring, were the broadleaf evergreens, like rhododendrons, hollies, things like that. And even your evergreen bushes and evergreen trees. Those were the things we saw the most damage from this spring because they were still transpiring a lot more through the winter months. So they had the most damage to them. So one of the problems we start to see, especially with heat, but drought will do this as well. And this is leaf scorch. I've been starting to see this one as it's getting a little bit warmer. Plus you couple that with the drought. So it starts on the ends or the tip or the edges of the leaves and it moves inward. And that's a scorch situation. So it's basically, it's not getting enough moisture to keep the entire leaf green and happily growing. Spruce needles, you actually might see where half the needle the furthest away from the branch will start to turn brown and the back side, the closest to the branch, will stay green. And so that's going to be worse on those newer and smaller trees, those newly planted trees and things like that, because they don't have the root system to go looking for more irrigation. So that's why, when we talk about irrigation during drought situations, we think about the newly planted ones first, but you still do need to pay attention to those older, more established trees. In a drought as extensive as what we have seen, it will damage trees of all ages. And so here's just a little bit more, just showing how the ends of those needles on an evergreen are going to be brown, where the interior there is green. It's not going to kill the tree. Oftentimes when we see that scorch, it might lead to a premature leaf drop, but it's not going to hurt it. So just make sure that you're irrigating it properly and using those organic mulches. Rock mulch and other inorganic mulches can increase that problem, and landscape fabrics can increase the problem as well. Go ahead, Sarah. So another one that can be intensified during drought situations is verticillium wilt. This is one that is kind of similar to like a Dutch elm disease type of problem, but it's in that vascular area, the vascular tissue. And what you'll see is, a branch will just have brown crunchy leaves still on there. You might see some discoloration like shown in these pictures here. But what you look at is underneath the cambium layer. So you just peel off that first little layer of bark, and in that cambium layer, you'll actually see streaks in there, and that's that verticillium wilt. This is a soil-borne fungus, so it's always there, but will get intensified due to bad growing conditions, such as a drought. Go ahead, Sarah. So it causes branch dieback. Typically, it's, a branch here, a branch there kind of thing, and we can just prune that branch out, but there really is no cure for it. So you can't, use a fungicide to help, get through that or whatever. So just prune out those infected branches and get rid of them. Don't compost those. Obviously avoiding excessive fertilization. In any case, when a tree is stressed, if you fertilize it, it can further stress the problems. But you just something to be aware of. This is one we might see a little bit more of. So it's always there, but just the right conditions will make it really come out. Go ahead, Sarah. This one is armillaria root rot, which you'd think a root rot in a drought doesn't make much sense, but it's it's that stress. So this is called shoestring root rot. It is a fungus, and the shoestring-like structures are going to invade the roots or right at that crown of the tree. And it's always there, but the wounding or just stressed trees will lead to this being more problematic. This one's really not spread like through the soil. It's spread more by root to root contact. So if one tree has it and the other one has some injury or whatever, it can spread that way. So it's best to get rid of those trees, but it's that stress that will cause it. And it causes that fungus to show up as that whitish appearance on down at the crown or right at the roots there. And eventually it probably will kill your tree. Sometimes I think they can live through it for a while, but I think eventually it does, your tree will succumb to it. But just something else to be watching out for. Go ahead, Sarah. Another one, and I was actually over at my brother-in-law's yesterday, and he has a lot of spruce trees around his property, and a lot of them had that cytospora canker at the top on the blue spruce. There are a lot of different types of this cytospora that can affect a lot of different types of trees, but I see it probably most often in a spruce tree. And so the top is completely dead on these trees. And again, this one's intensified by the drought because the tree is stressed. Another thing that will lead to more of this is if you have hail damage. And I know we've had a few storms when we did get rain, some heavier storms came through and brought some hail. I think I woke up last Sunday to hail pounding on my roof. Fortunately, it was little, but hail wounds are a wound where that canker can come in. So canker is a fungus, but there is no treatment for it. And basically where it gets into the tree, it will kill the tree from that point out or that point up. So a lot of times it's just way up there on the trunk. You'll see that sap flow. You can cut below the canker and it'll be okay, but it's never going to look right again. But if it's in the branches, sometimes you can just remove a branch and it'll be okay. But this is just another one to keep an eye out for. Okay, Sarah. And then chlorosis, again, it's your roots are damaged by the drought. So remember what I told you way at the beginning, the roots are damaged. So once the roots are damaged, you're going to have more of these problems. And so iron chlorosis is one I've seen quite a bit of this year. A lot of our trees are lime green, not dark green. And so it's really a lack of iron, but it's because the roots aren't able to access that iron and get it throughout the tree. And so you'll notice dark green veins in the leaves of your plants, but overall the rest of it is like a lime green color. Yeah, like Sarah's showing here. And we see it a lot in like maples. Of course, pin oak is really common with it and things like that. If this is a situation where it's happening every year, you can do a trunk injection or apply iron in the soil around the trunk, but it's, it might just be just because of the year, and could wait and see what it looks like next year. It's not usually going to kill the tree outright, but sometimes when they start to get chlorosis, it's the beginning of the end for some of those trees, especially in pin oaks. But just make sure you're watering correctly and you've got that mulch around them. And there's a really good guide from the Nebraska Forest Service on different types of remedies for iron corrosis. So it goes through how to do the iron in the soil around the trunk. So go ahead, Sarah. And that was all that I had on my section. So we can do either all the questions at the end, or if people had questions now for what I discussed.
Yeah, so if you have questions, you can sure just put them in the chat box and we'd be happy to answer those for you as we go along. You know, our trees unfortunately have sustained a lot of damage in the last year and a half or even more from drought. And so we're going to see some of these problems coming in over the course of the next few years. And it's difficult for homeowners to realize that some of these things are connected back to drought, you know, once the drought ends.
Yeah.
But we as landscape managers, you know, realize that these things are connected. So it's just there's some things for you to watch for in your landscapes. So can you see Barb's question, Nicole?
I do. When you see the top dieback, will it be okay? Well, that's kind of a tough one. So the problem is, if the top is truly dead, it's not going to like next spring be fine. And if you need to cut that back, what like with the river birches, what we see is, yeah, you could probably cut the top half off and it may survive. But remember, the damage is coming because of the root damage. It's going to take a while for that to build back. And also, if you cut that top off that tree, you've got a big open wound where that tree is, it's going to be hard for it to recover from that. You've also lost the central leader. So it's, you know, you could play around with it a little bit if you want to, but in the end, I don't think it's a good outlook for that tree. Sarah, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I agree. I mean, if the branches are truly dead, if they have no leaves on them at this point in the season, then the branches are most likely dead. You can cut out the dead branches, and you know, you could work with the tree. You could try to take really good care of it and give it a chance to grow back. But you know, you've lost a substantial portion of the canopy. So it becomes kind of an aesthetic question. Are you willing to work with this tree after it's lost half of its canopy, or you know, does it look too bad and you just want to remove it? But you can certainly take out the dead.
Yeah.
And so Barb is asking about Cytospora.
And if it's on one side, particularly inside, so if you're seeing it, you know, if it's just on a few branches, yeah, you can cut those branches out and the tree will most likely be all right. As long as it's not, you know, again, it's that aesthetic thing. Sometimes we have to lose too much of those branches on like a spruce tree or something like that, and then it just doesn't look right, or it's not serving its purpose as a windbreak. So it's kind of you'd want to cut out the infected branches, the dead branches, but it may or may not be look how you want it to. And the drought tolerant trees are more successful. Just they're adapted for droughtier conditions. Obviously, like when I made my comparison with like swamp white oak to bur oak, swamp white oak is adapted for more of wet climates, wet areas. And so that's not going to do well if it doesn't have enough moisture, versus a bur oak that is adapted for, you know, growing in, maybe normally it grows in more dry areas and things like that. And so they're just, it's how they develop and how their roots are and how much able they are to reach for more moisture that other plants may not be able to. Does that make sense by explaining that well?
Yep.
It may have something to do with you know, like some trees put on more cuticle, more of a waxy layer that prevents water loss or enables them to hold on to water better. You know, they may be able to continue to photosynthesize with lower amounts of water internally. So there are various mechanisms that trees develop that enable them to be more drought tolerant.
Right.
And it's just helpful for us to be able to identify those species that do have better drought tolerance so that we can utilize them, you know, in areas, maybe in a landscape where it's difficult to water. You know, we can put those trees as opposed to a tree that we might select purposefully to put in an area that stays wetter. You know, we might use a bald cypress, or we might use another tree that is more adapted to that wet soil.
I'll put a plug in here for trees that can go into summer dormancy.
Mhm.
One of the most important ones for us is hackberry. It's genetically able to drop its leaves in a drought and still keep trucking, whereas like most maples couldn't do that. So hackberry and even our Ohio buckeye can go into summer dormancy. So not a whole lot of species do that, but that's their adaptive genetic adaptation.
Kind of like bluegrass, right?
Yeah.
Which brings us right into our turf topic.
There
So,
we go.
yeah. So we know some of you in managing the landscapes, you, aside from your trees and your ornamental beds, you may also have some turf that you're managing. And coming into spring this year, this is what some of our turf looked like. You know, it was looking pretty rough. We had a lot of dieback in turf, a lot of thinning that happened from last year's drought and the dry winter. And so we had some rough looking turf this spring. And of course, as the year has progressed, a lot of these open spots now have filled with weeds. So we've got purslane, we've got knotweed, we've got, you name it, we've got weeds coming into these thin areas. So, you know, what do we do now? And I just wanted to talk real quickly about some work that we're doing with master gardeners on assessing moisture levels in soil. And in this picture, what you're looking at is a lawn. The lawn is on the left-hand side and the HOA managed turf is on the right-hand side. And exact same type of turf, fertilized in the same way by the same lawn company. The only difference between these two sections of turf is how they're watered. The turf on the left is watered less often, but more deeply. So this homeowner is trying to get their moisture to go down to at least that 6-inch depth with every irrigation, but they're watering as infrequently as possible. The turf on the left is watered at least twice a week, no matter whether it needs water or not. And they're applying about, or they're running their irrigation system for about 15 to 20 minutes per zone. They're not really looking at how deep that water is going. And so it's striking to me to look at a picture like this and see that there is quite a visible difference between the left and the right and how green that turf is, just simply based on watering. So, you know, as I said, we want to water turf deeply, but infrequently. And so, you know, that may mean that after you've moistened that soil down to about a 6-inch depth, you may not have to water for a week or a week and a half, or maybe even 2 weeks, depending on what air temperatures are at that time of the year. And so how do you measure the depth of how deeply the soil has been moistened by irrigation? Well, we're recommending just using a simple screwdriver. So you take a long-bladed screwdriver like this and push it into the soil. And as you can see, this screwdriver came up with some soil attached to it, both to the mid part of the blade and to the tip. You could feel that soil, but this is an indication that that soil actually has quite a bit of moisture in it right now. So if you use the screwdriver and this is what you found in your turf, then what we would suggest is that you maybe wait 4 or 5 days, then go out, measure the soil moisture again, and then make a decision. Do you need to water or is there still plenty of moisture in the soil? And I think we really underrate our turf grasses as far as how drought tolerant they are. Specifically tall fescue, which is in the picture, this is a tall fescue turf. And tall fescue is very drought tolerant, has a very deep root system. It actually goes quite a bit deeper than the 6 inches that we're using as a guideline. And it can go fairly long periods between irrigations. We don't need to spoon feed turf with irrigation 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times a week. Sometimes we water way too often. So you can use this screwdriver method, or you can look for symptoms of wilting in turf. The color change. If you're really paying close attention, as the grass gets drier, you're going to see that color change from a bright kind of a medium to dark green, and it'll go a little off. It'll go a little bit gray. I always think of it as grayish, kind of a grayish blue-green as it's starting to wilt. Or you can walk in the grass. And if the grass blades have not sprung up from where you stepped within just a minute or two, then that indicates that grass is actually wilting which is indicating a moisture deficit. So we sometimes need to set our turf up for success in the spring by not starting to water too early. You know, this year was an exception because we had extremely dry conditions in May, but typically May is one of our wettest months of the year. And yet I see homeowners and landscape managers turning on irrigation systems at the end of April and starting to water their turf right away in May, when really we want to let the grass grow dryly at that point, which will help to encourage the depth of that rooting system and help to set your turf up to be in a better position to tolerate dry conditions in midsummer. But we would really encourage you to try this screwdriver method to help you assess soil moisture and decide when you need to water. And anything that we can do to help grow that root system is going to make our turf better able to tolerate dry conditions. One of the best ways or best physical, mechanical methods for improving root development in the turf is aeration. And we find, you know, if you have a compaction in the soil, or you're dealing with maybe new construction in an area of the landscape that you manage, then there's a good chance that you're going to have some compaction in that soil. And it's always difficult for any kind of plant to grow roots into compacted soil, whether it's a tree, shrubs, perennials, and also turf. You can see here in this picture, after aeration, what that turf does is it grows roots like mad into those aeration holes. So this is a great technique to help to improve the root growth and establishment of your turf grass. So we see aeration really improves root growth as it helps to reduce compaction. It also helps improve water percolation. It helps reduce runoff since we have better percolation of that water into the soil. And it can also help us break up thatch. So if you find you are developing an excess thatch layer in your grass, aeration is the best way to deal with that. So when do we aerate? Well, with our cool season grasses, we want to aerate in the spring or in the fall when those grasses are growing most actively. So here in this chart, you can see that our grasses, Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue, are growing roots most actively from about, you know, April into May, and then again in that September, October timeframe. So those are the ideal times to aerate. And you always want to do core aeration where you're pulling up a plug. We never do tine irrigation in Nebraska because solid tine aeration actually increases compaction between the tines. So use a core aerator, and your goal is to try to get cores that are about 3 inches or so deep and pull those up on the soil surface and then let them break down. Okay. Now, if you had really severe turf damage from dry conditions this year and last year, then we're coming right into the window for overseeding. So August 15th to September 15th is the ideal time of year to overseed, even better than spring. And so here at the end of July into early August is the time to prepare your site for overseeding. And the best way to prepare is aeration. So you get that aerator out, aerate those areas you need to thicken back up, aerate them really heavily with 2 or 3 passes over the area. And then you're ready to put your seed down. There has been some research that has shown that if you don't want to aerate, you can also power rake after you've put the seed down, and power raking can help to establish that good seed soil contact also. Okay. Then you're going to put down a starter fertilizer because our turf seedlings need some high phosphorus fertility in the early stages of growth. That really helps them. You can lightly rake or roll to help get those seeds in good contact with the soil. And if you have an area where you cannot water well, maybe you don't have any irrigation at all, or you're limited on the amount of irrigation you can do, then in that situation, applying a mulch is going to be really important to help you hold in soil moisture. So if you have access to some straw and you want to look for straw that is as weed-free as possible, then very lightly apply that straw to the soil. You're going to want to see at least 50% of the soil through the straw. So we're talking about a very light layer. And that one bale of straw should cover about 1,000 square feet. That will help to hold whatever moisture you can provide to those seedlings as they germinate. And here in this picture, you're looking at a drop spreader. A drop spreader is the best way to apply seed for an overseeding. A whirligig spreader, or I'm blanking on the name, a broadcast spreader is not a great way to do seeding. So use a drop spreader. Okay. Here you're looking at this picture into some new turf grass seedlings that are just getting started. This is what you want to see after the first few weeks that your seed has been down. One important management strategy is to start mowing right away, because mowing helps those seedlings to start to tiller or send out secondary stems, and it will help that grass to thicken up quickly. So you can lower your mowing height in the initial stages of a new seeding and go down to about 1.5 to 2 inches. But then very quickly, we want you to raise that mowing height again and get back up to 3 to 3.5 inches, which should be a standard mowing height for most of our turf. Then again, some additional fertility as you go into the fall to help those seedlings thrive and get off to a good start. And be really careful with any herbicides you use. You have to be very selective with the products that you use that will not damage a new seeding. And so I've listed the 3 for you here that are labeled for use on new seedings. Mesotrione is good for, you can be applied as a pre-emergent to prevent crabgrass and foxtail with a new seeding. Quinclorac is good for broadleaf weeds, and then also carfentrazone will help with broadleaf weeds. Don't go back to using the standard products like 2,4-D dicamba and such with a new seeding, because they can damage your seeds. Okay, we move forward. And then mow it tall. Get back to that taller mowing height as much as possible, because there is a direct correlation between the height of the foliage and the depth of the roots. And we want to get back to mowing it tall as soon as possible. So we encourage that deep rooting system. Okay, here's my last slide. And I just wanted to point out the fertility needs between an established turf and a young turf can be quite different. We can apply a lot less fertilizer to an established turf, one that's over 20 years old, and that turf can be beautiful and fine, as opposed to a young turf, especially on disturbed soil or new construction. And so here, if you look at the fall applications, you'll see on a young turf, we're going to apply, and if you're not doing any overseeding at all, then you could think about doing a late August, early September application, and then a mid-October application with a quick release water-soluble fertilizer product. Now, if you're doing an overseeding, this is a little different because you're going to apply a starter fertilizer. Then about a month later, you're going to apply a complete fertilizer, and then you might come back with a mid-October application on that young turf. Okay, we have a new turf grass lawn calendar for eastern Nebraska, and maybe as Becky is talking, I'll put a link to that in the chat box for you to reference. But it breaks down the differing needs as far as fertility between a young turf and an older established turf to help us be as conservative as possible as we can on applying fertilizer. Okay. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. I'll be happy to answer them. But in respect of time, I'm going to pass it over to Becky, and she's going to talk with you about water and water quality.
Well, like both Sarah and Nicole have been saying, the percolation within your soils is utmost important. And for me, my whole spiel is pretty much there's no new water. Of course, the water cycle is just constant recycling. So we're predominantly recharged from precipitation and snow melt here in Nebraska. And of course, like it's been said before, we've had 2 years now of very low levels of precipitation, both with snow and rain. And so within our High Plains aquifer, the Ogallala aquifer, our biggest concern is that we limit contamination and the depletion of the two. And so we want, those two concerns are the highest for us. And it's not just people that have a private well, but then we have our municipal wells. And I've had a lot of people being calling lately saying, well, I live just outside of Lincoln. I'm on my own well. So our homeowners association has told us just to ignore the voluntary water reduction for usage. And I'm like, well, that's not really a good idea because we're all drawing from the same. So everything that we do within our environment has the potential to positively or negatively impact our soils, our surface water bodies, and ultimately our groundwater. Next. So just a few groundwater basics. Of course, we have porosity and permeability. Porosity, of course, is the open space and voids between solid materials, such as the cracks between your rock and your sand and your gravel and even your clays. And then your permeability is the measure and the ease that the water flows through those porous spaces of your rock and your sand and your gravel and the gravels and clays. And of course, in eastern Nebraska, we have a lot of clay in our soil, and therefore compaction can happen more easily and is probably a little bit harder to uncompact that. So with like was talked about earlier, tree roots and vegetation roots are some of the best ways to do that. And of course, our native species do really well because they have deeper roots, so they're able to open up that soil. And so this is just kind of to show you that the one square is that rock may be very porous. There might be a lot of spaces, but it's not interconnected. So if it's not interconnected, that water can't be trapped there, so to speak, or hang out there. A lot of people think of aquifer as an underground lake, and that's really not true. It's all of the interconnected spaces within our sands and gravels and rocks. And of course, then I have the image of the different wells and the different types of geology that we have within Nebraska, where we can have just one aquifer, or you could be sitting on top of two, and where you have a confined aquifer situation, and there's one above the other. Next. So the biggest thing that we really ask not only homeowners to do, but also folks that work within public garden areas and towns and cities, is to create and update share that map of the property that you're maintaining, whether it be a residence, whether it be a public space, it doesn't matter. And you want to make sure that you're marking the residence, the building or buildings, your property lines, water and sewer mains, well and septic, tank drain field systems, the irrigation system, electric, any other buried objects, and then the distances between those said points. And so this is important not only for when you come time to do landscaping, you know that you don't want to plant a tree right next to a water line or a septic line, and any other deeper rooted plants. It also gives you good information to have for future additions or structure of permanent features, such as a pool or a water feature. A lot of cities are putting in splash parks and such to an existing property. Of course, then you have your tank and your drain field location for system inspection and pumping and repair. A number of parks and such aren't necessarily on city water or municipal septic, so you want to know where those things are located. If you are having to put in a well, I know of places down south of Lincoln. That's where I live, in between Lancaster and Gage. And you want to know where the best place for well placement is. You want to make sure that you've got the setback distances recognized. Of course, and then there's always the new running of water or septic lines or irrigation lines. And lastly, just for new management that comes in, so they have a good idea of what exists there, if you're repurposing a space or just the sale of a property. Next. So there's different water contaminant categories, and within drought, of course, some folks are still applying their fertilizers and their herbicides. And we want to be cognizant of what we're applying, and then making sure that there's enough moisture to dissipate and kind of not have it so concentrated in some areas. But within water, we have point source pollution where we know the cause, where that it can be immediately identified, such as a spill or discharge. Then we have the non-point source pollution, which is a source of pollution that can't easily be identified, but might come from different sources. So we might have some homeowner herbicides and pesticides entering the equation, but then we might have some commercial as well. Or just a mix of different things, or even a combination of ag and land, private land, or city put down chemicals and such. So there's multiple sources that non-point can come from. Next. So I'm going to kind of briefly just say that, of course, well maintenance, I'm not sure, there we go. We've got well maintenance is important. Some of you might have private wells at home, but you always want to make sure that that cover's on top, that your vent has the correct screening in there, so that that any bugs and critters can't get down into the well. And of course, in Nebraska, we have well construction regulations. And so that there's different things that cap that it must meet. And then, of course, or fence posts or concrete filled steel casings around a wellhead is hugely helpful, especially in public spaces, to where we don't have people backing over them, running it over with a lawnmower, damaging that upper part of the casing and everything in any way. Next. And then, of course, it's important of the above ground finish of that wellhead. You want to have it in the sloped way, and you want to make sure that it's not vulnerable to flooding or contamination from other drainage from other areas. You want to divert that away from your wellhead, and you don't want any pooling of water. Next. So runoff. Whether we're in a drought situation or not in a drought situation, runoff happens regardless. And so what ends up on the ground, and especially on our hard surface areas, usually ends up in our surface water and or our groundwater. Next. So of course, hard surfaces are the biggest culprit, and they don't allow for that water to soak in the ground. So that's where we want folks to go permeable. And I know Nicole discussed earlier about about organic mulch versus rock. Rock isn't a bad thing if it's in a place where you have a lot of runoff, like you see in the upper photograph. You're not worried about plants surviving there, but you don't want any erosion and such like that. In the middle two, it's a perfect example that just happened this last week, actually at my dentist's office, where you had so much water coming off the roof, where you see in the right-hand middle photo, coming out of that gutter, it immediately just started eroding. So it is taking the dirt and the organic mulch, and then you can see where that organic mulch in the left-hand photo just ended up dispersing all over the sidewalk and even into the parking lot. And then down below is a choice of where you have some rock, but then you also have a mix of organic. And so choosing native plants, like we've kind of been a theme of this, and grasses and shrubs that have deep root systems, really helps to combat the erosion. It aids in the filtering of water before it recharges the aquifer. So it's all good. And they've got a pipe that comes off of that structure that moves that gutter water further away from the building. When you're applying your herbicides and pesticides and such, you always want, and even when you're cutting the lawn, you want to make sure that all of that is swept into the lawn and not on your hard surfaces. You want to pick up trash and pet waste, because all of that then ends up going down into the storm sewers and then ends up in our surface water, which ultimately can end up in our groundwater. Next. So rain barrels are, of course, most of you, I presume, are very familiar with them. It's not a new concept, and a lot of folks have been calling me about this, both homeowners, and then I've even talked to some folks affiliated with cities that and municipalities that take care of parks and such. It's a great way, a beneficial way to collect rainwater from roofs and gutters. It's not legal in every state, but it is in Nebraska. And it's, of course, important to cover that top of your barrel so you don't get the prevent debris and critters from entering into the water below. Of course, it's advised that we don't use rain barrel water on vegetables or edible crops because potentially you've got bird feces and such coming off a roof, and that can introduce bacteria to your vegetables. And of course, gravity-fed irrigation lines can be connected then to that rain barrel, or watering containers can be filled from them to use that water in other places. Next. So directing the rainwater is one of the biggest things, and this is from the Douglas Sarpy Extension Office, and it's just kind of a cool way to do it. I've seen it at other state park entities as well with similar type things, but where you have either your picnic shelters, your visitor centers, other buildings that can be fitted with rain barrels, and then connected to the, of course, connected to the gutter system. And then the irrigation pipes are used to disperse that water so that you're not having any runoff. But you can have, so in, you're not, you're moving and dispersing the water over a greater surface area. And it ultimately then waters your plants and garden beds a little bit more efficiently and effectively. And like I said before, it's all about trying to cut back on the runoff and the erosion of the soil and or mulch that's that you have. And it's a kind of a cool system. Some people don't think about them, but the one over at Douglas Sarpy office, it's just a matter of using PVC pipe with holes drilled in it, kind of like with the older system of irrigating with ag when you have the pipe irrigation. And then of course, like I said earlier, it not only helps with dispersing that water over a greater area and making it more useful, but it also cuts back on water pollution a bit, lowers the water costs. Anybody that's using water from municipality, you've got that water bill coming through, and so if you can cut back on that and use your roof water to the greatest extent that you can, that's best. Recycling of groundwater, yeah, it kind of is. But like I said earlier, there's no new water, so we're always in a recycling type of mode. And then it's pretty inexpensive to use. So Nebraska Extension and such has different materials that can be looked into as far as setting up kind of system like this. And I know that there's a number of community gardens and such that use it. So I think that's all I have. Yep. So that's our ways to contact each of us. And we will take any questions, I guess, that are directed towards Sarah, myself, or if you have more for Nicole.
Yeah. So it looks like we have a few minutes here to answer some questions, and we have one in the chat box that Justin had entered about using buffalo grass as a lawn. And so I have to just preface this and say that I am very partial to buffalo grass. I think it's a great turf, but it's not a great turf for every site. Buffalo grass is a native warm season grass, and it requires full sun. So it's not going to be a great grass for shady areas. It will not grow under trees. It's as a warm season grass, it does very well during the hot part of the year and is quite drought tolerant. So if you want to experiment with buffalo grass, one area that you could think about would be if you have a parking area between a curb and a sidewalk that's in the full sun and quite dry. If you did a little bit of soil improvement, because sometimes that soil in that spot can be pretty nasty. But if you address the soil a little bit, you could try growing some buffalo grass there. If you have an acreage or you have a larger area of full sun in a park or a landscape that you manage, buffalo grass might be a good option there too. As a warm season grass, you have to change your practices a little bit, and you have to look at some different products for weed control. But given the right site, I think buffalo grass can be a great option.
All right, thanks, Sarah.
Mhm.
I see a couple more questions here. Mary Green, can you say something about watering older established trees during a drought? What do older trees need? That is a big issue because it's not as easy as just running some water on them.
Right. Yeah, and that is one thing that we see a lot is, people will call me with a tree question, and they'll say, I've got this tree and it's got problems, and I ask what they're doing for irrigation. And most of the time they tell me it's in an irrigated lawn. Well, we have to remember an irrigated lawn is not an irrigated tree. They have very different requirements in, you know, in what they need for irrigation. And so Sarah's method with the screwdriver, it works just as well for a tree as it does with turf. You're just going to want it to go deeper. So you're wanting to make sure that it's down to, you know, most of our tree roots are in the top 12 to 18 inches of soil. And so if you can get down to that area with a real long screwdriver and really see that mud like Sarah showed in that one photo, then you're okay. If it's not doing that, then you would need to do a nice deep irrigation so that you are getting down deeper into the soil surface. You know, when we water tree or turf, like Sarah said, you're watering to about 6 inches deep. So you're not getting quite as deep as what you need for that tree. So like Justin said, it's dependent on the soil type, it's dependent on the tree, it's dependent on what else is growing around the tree. If you've got mulch, how hot it is, how much moisture we're seeing, how often, as I see Barb just asked. So, you know, it's a lot of figuring it out, what's doing well around that tree, and that screwdriver is going to help you as best as anything. What I would say on how often is I would probably check your soil moisture once a week at least around those trees to see if you're getting that deep irrigation. And so if you do need to irrigate, a slow, longer irrigation. So, you know, a soaker hose, a sprinkler, even using the hose, just letting it trickle and moving it around a few times around that tree, so that you're getting deeper into the soil profile. And, you know, and you don't want it just right up at the tree either. So you want to go out so that the whole root system. So basically, if you go to that drip zone, that's the majority of your roots. I mean, they go out way further than that. But if you get moisture really covering that root zone or that drip zone, that should be pretty good. But just making sure you're getting real deep with that irrigation. And Justin, if you have more to say on that, you feel free to chime in.
No,
Or
I
Sarah
agree.
too.
Yeah, it's such a tough deal. So if trees are on their own most years and then you get in a drought like this, like Nicole said, if you can water at the drip line, that's probably helpful. And I always think in terms of an average spring and summer of moisture is probably 1 inch a week in eastern Nebraska. So if you're down 8 inches, maybe you water a couple times in May and June, early July, but the most critical time for watering trees is May, June, July, not August, September, October. So maybe think that way a little bit.
But
I
you know,
hear
like
homeowners often say when they ask us with a tree that's not doing well, and they'll say, well, trees have deep roots. They used to teach when I was in middle school, they taught us that the roots of a tree were as deep as the tree was tall. And so people think, oh, the roots can pull water from all of this soil. I mean, they go as deep as the tree is tall. Well, we know now that there are some anchoring roots that go deep into the soil, but those roots do not function to pull up moisture. The primary water absorbing roots are in the shallow layers of the soil from down to about 18 to 24 inches. That's where 90% of the roots are going to be. So if that layer of soil is dry, then your tree, it's not pulling up water. That's when we're starting to see the root death that Nicole talked about, the death of the root hairs, death of the major roots. So we need to keep that upper layer of the soil moist for our trees to do well.
Yeah, right on. Well said, everybody. Right. So, and then maybe think in terms of in a drought situation, if your tree is in an irrigated lawn and that irrigation has to be shut off or turned back, you may end up with a struggling tree. So maybe try to manage everything we're saying here comprehensively. Think about what the next drought's going to be and manage your lawn and landscape accordingly so it's not struggling when the water shuts off.
Yep.
We can get into a real double-edged sword where people are watering their turf multiple times a week, and we get a shallow layer of soil where there's no oxygen moving into the soil because all those soil pores are full of water. And yet we don't have water going down deep enough for the tree. So we've got a situation where we have two things that are going wrong for the tree to really do well. That's why we want to water deeply and infrequently for the turf. And we also want to water very deeply for the trees.
And as Justin said, we're in a drought now. We're kind of easing out a little bit. It's not going away right away, but we could see another one anytime. So you just don't, you want to condition your plants so that they can survive a little bit better.
Yeah, Sarah Buckley, are you still on? We have a question about where can we access the taped program? Where are we housing those, Sarah?
So we thought that we could send out an email to the registrants of a Zoom meeting, and it turns out that Justin and I are not tech savvy enough to do that.
Yeah.
So we are putting them on the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum YouTube page. And
All
it
right.
takes a little bit of time to process, but it'll probably be up by tomorrow. And then I'll have Michelle share on Facebook that link when it's live.
Thanks for asking that, Barb. Yes, these are all on the YouTube page. I forget about that, Sarah, so. We're after 1 o'clock. I don't want to have our panel stay on any longer. They're probably ready for lunch. Are there any last questions here we're seeing? I don't see any. We really appreciate this. That was outstanding, you guys. Sarah, Nicole, and Becky, thank you for doing that. You guys act like you know what you're talking about, surprisingly. So I'm just kidding.
Thank you for letting us join you, Justin. We appreciate it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was awesome. Thank you so much for doing it. And everybody, let's hope we get more rain, but be ready for more drought. So
Right.
Thanks.
All right.
bye, everybody.
See ya.
Bye.